2003 and 2012. And so just briefly, violent conflict erupted in Darfur in 2003 between the government and a variety of rebel groups. It quickly became the world's largest humanitarian operation. At its height, there were about 200 different organizations working in Darfur. And at these 200, approximately 24 engaged in what's called cross-line deliveries of assistance. So assistance that's transported from the government area into an area controlled by a rebel group. The ICRC, MSF, and the WFP were some of the largest organizations that did this type of work. And so what this report does is it chronicles the engagements that these groups had and the difficulties that they had in contacting armed non-state actors, negotiating with armed non-state actors, and traveling into territory controlled by armed non-state actors at different stages in the conflict. One thing that the report tries to highlight is that over the past 10 years, there have been a variety of different international interventions aimed at resolving the crisis, including political efforts revolving around the peace process, international justice efforts, especially the ICC, and then peacekeeping efforts by AMIS and UNIMIT. And what the report shows is that these international interventions, for the most part, not only failed to resolve the conflict, but often made it progressively more difficult for humanitarian actors to access and assist vulnerable populations throughout Darfur, especially those populations that were living inside areas controlled by armed non-state actors. So just briefly, the armed non-state actors in Darfur fall, broadly speaking, into two categories. The first category is rebel movements, and as you may have heard, in the recent past, the rebel movements in Darfur have fractured into dozens, literally dozens of small factions. But the vast majority of these are breakaway groups from the two original rebel movements, the Sudan Liberation Army and the GEM. And throughout the conflict, both these groups, and particularly the SLA, have controlled significant territory throughout Darfur. And from about 2004 to 2006, let's say, the SLA and the GEM, to a lesser extent, controlled a significant portion of North Darfur, a lot of the central mountainous area in Darfur called Jebel Mara, and then small pockets throughout the rest of Darfur. Now, this territory has sort of increased and decreased throughout the conflict, and right now it's sort of, there's very little territory that's still firmly controlled by rebel groups outside of the rebel stronghold in Jebel Mara. The other category of armed non-state groups are what is commonly referred to as Janjaweed. The report goes into the humanitarian engagement with the Janjaweed and with Janjaweed-affiliated populations. And what the Janjaweed are, crudely speaking, were proxy militias, government proxy militias that were recruited primarily, although not exclusively, from Arab and nomadic communities. So this is just a map of the rebel-controlled territory in 2012. Just gives you an idea that there are these little pockets of Darfur that are still controlled by armed non-state groups. And throughout the conflict, that territory has varied considerably. So just back in 2003 to 2004 was when the major violence took place, and this is when the vast majority of civilian deaths occurred. During the first 6 months of the conflict, there was very limited humanitarian access to Darfur and almost no humanitarian access to any rebel-controlled areas in Darfur. The rebels themselves freely admit that they had very little humanitarian strategy at this point. Their goal was to fight against the government, and they were not engaged with any humanitarian concerns. About 6 to 8 months into the conflict, in April or May 2004, access opened up. The government began permitting NGOs to work in Darfur, and they arrived en masse around this time. Why exactly it opened up is a subject of great debate that the report goes into. Many attribute it to high-level advocacy, others to the ceasefire agreement, and some, perhaps more cynically, say that the government had accomplished its military goals by that point and was then willing to let the NGOs in. Also in 2004, the African Union mission AMIS arrived in Darfur with the consent of both parties to the conflict for the purposes of monitoring a ceasefire agreement. So then when we move on to 2004 to 2006, this is what is known as the golden age of access in Darfur, which does not mean that there were not difficulties. There was still an incredible amount during this time. But relatively speaking, the government decided to permit access throughout Darfur, including to most rebel areas, and the rebels themselves decided to develop a humanitarian strategy, appointed humanitarian coordinators, and began engaging constructively on humanitarian issues. Aid agencies were able to establish contacts with rebels and to negotiate access to their territory. These negotiations were, for the most part, led by UN OCHA and UNDSS in collaboration. It involved UNDSS officers in particular going out to the deep field, sort of doing a mapping of who's who of who the rebel movements were, establishing initial contacts, and introducing them to OCHA officers who then engaged in sort of formal negotiations with some of these groups, particularly the SLA. There were a lot of issues and problems throughout the negotiations. The major issue on the rebel side was that they were extraordinarily nervous that people entering their territory were agents of the government of Sudan, and so they wanted to vet all staff, particularly national staff. And ultimately, though, OCHA and the rebel groups were able to come to a formal written agreement, which is included at the back of the report. And for about 2 years, aid moved relatively freely throughout most of Darfur. One thing to keep in mind is that the rebels are widely perceived to have benefited from this assistance, both materially, as they often took assistance from NGOs indirectly, or in some rare instances were given it directly, and then they also benefited, perhaps most importantly, politically, from being able to provide, or being able to be seen to provide assistance to those people living in their territories. So in 2006, the Darfur Peace Agreement, known as the DPA, was signed by the government of Sudan and one rebel faction. After this agreement was signed, insecurity increased dramatically throughout Darfur. There's a variety of reasons for this increase in security. There was intra-rebel faction between signatory and non-signatory rebels. Also, Janjaweed and Janjaweed-affiliated populations were upset that they were excluded from the negotiations, or at least they perceived themselves to be excluded, and they began to turn their weapons against NGOs in a variety of instances. So between 2006 and 2008, OCHA and NGOs had to go back out to the field and renegotiate access with the rebel groups, especially with new rebel groups that were popping up, and they had to develop new security protocols for going out to the field. A lot of groups stopped going by road and started traveling by air, which we'll see later on led to distancing between themselves and a lot of these groups, as they no longer had contact with them along the way. That said, aid delivery did continue throughout this time to many rebel areas in most of Darfur. And in 2008, UNIMIT arrived. Just quickly, because I've been told I'm going over time, the report goes into a fair amount of depth the relationship between aid agencies and the Janjaweed and Janjaweed-affiliated populations. Particularly difficult get at the root of what this relationship was. Janjaweed and Darfur are often equated by members of the humanitarian community and by people inside Darfur to a certain extent as it's equated with being an Arab or with being a nomad, which is an inaccurate generalization. Also, many members of, or many people who, aid agency officials, initially considered Janjaweed to be government proxy militias, and sort of, as a result, would deal with the government and consider that dealing with the Janjaweed. And this led to a lot of difficulties when they realized that wasn't necessarily the case. And so the report talks about why there was such limited engagement between the Janjaweed and aid agencies. Talks about bias by the humanitarian community, the fact that some of these groups had fewer humanitarian needs. The government itself prevented aid agencies from accessing these groups, and the groups are often extraordinarily geographically isolated. So then moving quickly to 2009, the president of Sudan, President Bashir, was indicted by the International Criminal Court. In response to this indictment, the government expelled 13 international and 3 national aid agencies, and this had a dramatic impact on humanitarian assistance in Darfur, particularly on the assistance that was being delivered in areas that were controlled by rebel groups. So the groups that were expelled were the groups that were most likely to be, or were most engaged in protection activities, were most engaged in cross-line delivery of humanitarian assistance. And since this expulsion, there is we've not returned to a time where there's been significant assistance back inside rebel areas. So then between 2010 and 2012, access really disappeared. Sort of logic by the government of Sudan is fairly easy to lay out. They see the aid in South Sudan as leading to the separation. They see aid in Darfur as leading to the ICC indictment. And they see at times when they don't permit aid to be allowed in at all, such as in South Kordofan in 2012, all they get are strongly worded statements by Western governments at the UN and other places, and there's no real consequences for them. So during this time period, the humanitarian community largely stops trying to access rebel and contested areas. And then, sadly, at the end of 2012, there's really no more communication at all with rebels, and even UNIMID has no access to rebel areas, even though there's still serious, urgent humanitarian needs in a lot of these places. And so, just to conclude, there's two questions that aid agencies need to ask themselves. One is, whether anything could have been done differently over the past 10 years that would have facilitated continued access and greater assistance throughout the conflict, and whether there's anything that can be done right now to sort of reverse this trajectory and perhaps to regain access to areas controlled by rebel groups and increase the amount of assistance that's provided to vulnerable populations. Sadly, it doesn't, as we're standing right now, really look like this is going to be the case anytime in the future. The humanitarian community seems to be both less willing and unfortunately less able to pressure the government of Sudan to allow them to access these areas. So just briefly, if this were to take place and access is to be regained, a bunch of things are going to need to occur. UN donors are going to need to engage in a much more forceful and coordinated high-level advocacy campaign. Aid agencies are going to need to prioritize working in rebel areas. A lot of them right now have sort of given up on that idea entirely and are worried that even attempting to try to go back into these areas will be able to jeopardize their programming in other areas. The rebels themselves need to develop a humanitarian strategy. Throughout the interviews done with rebels for this report, it became clear that they're really, at least at the end of 2012, almost no levels, at least rebels at the senior political level, were thinking strategically about the issue of humanitarian access, and that definitely has to change if they want to get aid back in their territory. UNIMID has to more forcibly assert its independence with respect to its patrols. It has to start prioritizing civilian protection and getting back into rebel areas. There was a great deal of criticism at the way UNIMID has handled this, not only by NGOs and by rebels, but by UNIMID officials that I talked to for this report. One thing that no one is talking about, and it's highly controversial, is the idea of starting something which would be extraordinarily risky and logistically complicated, which is cross-border relief, coming either from Chad or from South Sudan across government-controlled territory into rebel areas in Darfur.
Jonathan,
And,
thank you very much. I think we'll have to stop you there.